Well, hello there. I was just reading this morning an article from Rosaria Butterfield. Rosaria Butterfield was a former lesbian English professor who converted to Reformed Calvinist Christianity and married a Christian pastor. And her story is often touted as a story of a person who is gay, ceasing to be gay. Now, it's an interesting question because I think as I read Butterfield's story, it's not clear that she in fact was a lesbian. It could be that she was simply identifying as a lesbian. And there's an interesting nuance there. And I have to work that out as I'm looking at her story because I'm going to talk about her and that story a little bit in the book that I'm writing on the theology of same-sex relationships. So I was doing that this morning and I came across an article anyway that she wrote in 2020. She's been writing for several years now for Desiring God Ministries, John Piper and the Gospel Coalition as well. And so I came across this article from Desiring God Ministries talking about COVID-19 and how we should think about it, called "Can the Pandemic Be an Answered Prayer?" And she explores, this is in May of 2020, how we can think about the pandemic providentially as part of God's design and plan uh, by beginning to identify ways that God is using the pandemic positively. Now, first of all, I do want to say, in a general sense, I believe in meticulous providence, which means that I believe that God has morally sufficient reasons for allowing all the evils that happen in the world. I don't believe that God is unaware of the things that happen or that they're out of his control. Rather, I believe that God foreknows the things that will happen, including the terrible things, including the pandemics, and God allows them for some morally sufficient reason. But I'm also very cautious about beginning to opine on the reasons that God has for allowing particular evils, because I think typically what ends up happening is you have a very bad theodicy that begins to emerge, and one I believe that is often malformative for the Christian. In other words, it makes us not more like Jesus, but if anything, potentially less like Jesus, as we begin to explore and opine on the different reasons that God has for allowing evil, such as rather infamously, one example, and admittedly this is low-hanging fruit, but when Christian evangelists were saying back in 2005, well, maybe the reason that Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans and so devastated the city, killing thousands of people, was because of their licentious celebration of Mardi Gras and things like that. I mean, I just think, no, let's not go there, folks. That's not going to help your apologetic, your theodicy, your understanding of providence. All of that brings me to this article. So, can the pandemic be answered prayer? And Butterfield here just gives several examples why she believes her church was having difficulty connecting with the community around them, and that sort of began to change with the rise of the pandemic in March of 2020. So now by May of 2020, she's already seeing these positive results and saying this is all part of the story that we can thank God for COVID-19. And I just wanted to skip down to this one part that really kind of leapt out to me. Okay, so she says this: have you considered the ramifications that this June will be the first in decades without a public gay pride march? Why is this big news? First, sexual identity depends on an affirming audience who can sway others to its side, using an ideology of personal freedom and victimhood. A virtual platform draws only the faithful, denying them the oxygen that this particular fire needs. Second, without an audience, sexual identity cannot be normalized. Here is the heart question for us: are you praising God for this disruption? Or is it your preference to complain about gay pride and other sins from the air-conditioned comfort of your home in the midst of an economy that benefits from all kinds of sin? So I'm trying to unpack the reasoning here. It seems to me that what Butterfield is saying is when people can gather in large groups and have things like parades, that gives the quote unquote gives the oxygen for people to become more affirming in their views, gay affirming, for example. Or I mean, if not just, of course, the gay community, but let's say that you have a community that's xenophobic, and every June there is a South Asian festival. Well, the South Asian festival also can't meet during COVID-19. Um, so you're not going to fight xenophobia if they can't collectively meet, because only the people who want to meet online will meet, if they're stuck with Zoom, but they can't meet in person. So fewer people will be exposed to South Asian culture, and relatively higher levels of xenophobia about South Asian culture will persist. The same logic is being applied here to gay pride. And it just seems to me this is such a bizarre way of thinking. For example, I mean, we know millions of people. Now I know that Butterfield didn't know that millions of people would die of COVID-19 in May of 2020, but certainly she could have anticipated there could be an astronomically high casualty rate. Already in areas like New York were being devastated in May of 2020 by COVID-19. People were gasping for their last breath, unable to get a breath in hospitals, and with medical personnel unable to do anything, and families cut off from being able to say goodbye to their loved ones. And we're supposed to be thankful for that because it disrupted the June 2020 Pride March. It just seems to me that this is such a fundamentally wrong-headed way of thinking. I'm amazed that somebody would put that into print. So I mean, here's why I don't go into the weeds speculating about what God is doing, why God has morally sufficient reasons for allowing terrible things, because typically the theodicies, the proposals that people come out with are things like this, right? God hit New Orleans and killed thousands of people in the floods that were produced by Hurricane Katrina because of Mardi Gras every year. And God is sending a pandemic so that he can disrupt the annual gay pride parade and thereby slow down the cultural acceptance of gay pride. And if you think this through, by this logic that Butterfield is giving us, then we should continue to pray for the disruption of pride marches, which means continue to pray for the spread of COVID-19 and maybe other even more infectious diseases that will prevent us from having social interactions with gay people and thereby increasing the cultural acceptance of being gay. Which again, to me, is just such a fundamentally wrong-headed way of thinking. And of course, I mean, again, among other things, that social disruption also impacts other social events, like the hypothetical South Asian festival, which decreases xenophobia against the South Asian community because it brings people into contact with South Asian individuals and their culture. That also is a casualty. Can those people lament that? I mean, is what I didn't see in the article was a clear role for lament. All I saw was Thanksgiving, and Thanksgiving for things, I mean, as I said, is seemingly trite and frankly offensive, as being thankful that there's a disruption of gay pride marches, even as people are dying by the thousands in hospital emergency rooms because they cannot get a breath. This to me is just very bad theology. If as the saying goes, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. I'd say don't say anything at all. If you don't have something good and sensible and helpful and illuminating to say about a terrible event like a global pandemic, then don't say anything at all. Don't surmise that part of the reason we can be thankful for it is that God is disrupting the social acceptance of the gay community, because that does nothing but dishonor the Christian community. And I mean, imagine the impact. Like the irony here is that Rosaria Butterfield, whether or not she was a lesbian at some point in time in the past, like actually same-sex attracted, she was identifying with that community intimately in the 1990s. And the fact that she can be so tone deaf as to how this would be understood and heard by other groups, and the way that it would present Christianity, to go on record being thankful for COVID-19 because it disrupts the social acceptance of the gay community because you can't have gay pride marches anymore. the fact that she can be so tone deaf in that really I find to be quite perplexing. Anyway, my dog is growling now, so I think that's time for me to stop.